Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to the ones that are joining from Asia, and good morning to the ones that are joining in Europe. My name is Demet Tunç. I lead the Customer Experience Council at the Conference Board. I also work as a management consultant in executive search and in leadership advisory. Today, we are going to have a very interesting topic on embracing complexity. I have my speaker, Fabrice Desmarais. Welcome, Fabrice.
Hi, Demet.
Before we start to talk about the content of this webcast, let me first update you on a couple of housekeeping rules to get the most out of this webcast. During the webcast, you can ask questions by typing in your question on the bottom left of your screen. If you want, you can download the presentation. It is available. And you can also view the full screen of the presentation in case you would like to. We would be very happy if you could share this program with people within your network who might have an interest on understanding more about embracing complexity. Let me first introduce you to Fabrice. Fabrice is a consultant, a leader, a business person that works with CEOs, senior executives, and teams on topics that relate to personal and collective growth, and also he's keen on increasing the effectiveness of teamwork. He combines business with management science, psychology, philosophy, and also spiritual elements. I must say that although he has a very concrete business background, having worked at McKinsey and now working at Eric Salmon and leading the leadership advisory practice at Eric Salmon and Partners, he's also a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher. He has been living in Asia for more than 2 decades. On the personal side, I know that he loves nature, he loves animals, he has 3 dogs himself. So, but he's a very interesting profile that combines the Western and the Eastern cultures and have teams work in a very productive and effective way. He's also a certified coach. It's a pleasure, Fabrice, to have you with us today on this leadership series. So you say that we need to embrace complexity and stepping out of the regular days that especially we are going through now. We're thinking about reducing reserving cash, reducing the expenses. We need to grow. We need to connect with our customers, with our clients. We need to engage with our employees. And we need to save, but we need to increase the bottom line. By the way, we also need to increase the top line. So there are so many things that are going on in the minds of the leaders. And so the world has always been complex, but in a situation like this, I think it is more complex than ever. So my first question to you is, how do you embrace complexity? Even before that, actually, what is complexity? What do you mean by complexity?
Yes, that's actually a very good starting point, Demet, and thank you for your introduction. So what is complexity? I think we need to define it because otherwise, and we need a precise vocabulary. So let me give you an example, and for that, I'll use the difference between a photocopy machine and a human being. And I will use a terminology that actually is not mine. It was introduced about 20 years ago by David Snowden when he created a framework to understand a phenomenon in the world called the Kinefin framework. And Snowden introduces 2 terms. Actually, his framework is a bit more complicated. I'll make it more simple for ourselves today. But the difference between complicated and complex, and this is really the essence of our discussion today. Complicated is my photocopy machine. So that photocopy machine is not simple by any means, right? It has required decades of innovation and of research. There's mechanical engineering, there's electronics, there's optics, there's laser technologies, there's ink technologies to produce what we call the modern photocopy machine. Having said that, whenever I put a piece of paper on the glass and I press the button, it always makes the same photocopy, or so you would hope. And I can produce thousands of identical machines. If I follow the process, if I follow the rules, I know exactly what the outcome will be. And that's, for me, the definition of complicated. No matter how much expertise goes into producing that machine, there's a certain predictability to the process. In contrast, what I call complex, and the whole topic of our discussion today, complexity, is, for example, a human being, a child. Of course, there's tons of books that have been written on how to raise a child, but really there is no predictability, so to speak, right? So we don't know whether this young boy here on the picture is going to become an accountant or an orchestra conductor or a drug dealer. It's very hard to predict, right? And we don't know what inputs will lead to what outputs. And this inability to connect outputs to inputs, which doesn't exist in the photocopy machine. In the photocopy machine, we know very well what inputs will produce what outputs in my production process. But with a human being, we have no understanding of the connection between inputs and outputs. And that's really the definition of complexity.
So, but in a real life situation, then how do I know whether the situation is a complicated or a complex one?
Well, there's a few criteria. With complicated phenomena, I can use expertise. The more expertise, the more experience I gain, the better I become at connecting inputs and outputs, the better I become at predicting the future in a way. With complex phenomena, no amount of expertise, no amount of experience will help you to better predict outcomes. There may be some minor correlations, but by and large, you don't understand the relationship between input and output. Small variations in input may produce huge variations in outputs. So, for example, I'm sure many in our audience today have more than one kid. And you may give the same education to your kids, bring them up in the same way, so to speak, in the same family environment, and yet the outputs will diverge, right? One child might become a school teacher, the other child could become an entrepreneur, etc. So very, very small variations in inputs can lead to huge variations in outputs. So essentially, there's a divergence to complexity, which doesn't exist in the complicated world. In the complicated world, small variations in input generate small variations in output. It's fairly linear, right? I can probably design equations, write equations that connect the two. But with complex phenomena, there's no amount of equations that can model the phenomenon. So that's essentially how you tell, am I looking at something that is fundamentally convergent, linear, predictable, where expertise matters, where I can develop best practices, or am I looking at a phenomenon where there's no linearity, it's fundamentally divergent, it's no amount of expertise and no amount of experience will really help me, right? So that's essentially the difference between the two.
Okay, very clear.
Now, what's happening in the world today? Well, we have been brought up in a world that really values the complicated phenomena, right? So, as I said earlier, we want certainty, right? And the complicated world gives us certainty, whereas the complex world is essentially a big bundle of uncertainty, and we don't like that. So, our entire leadership thinking is designed around making sense of the world and making it predictable. And that really stems from the Industrial Revolution, when we started deploying vast amount of capital into productive power, because we were at that point around the middle of the 18th century, we started mastering fossil energies. And so suddenly we had this massive amount of energy and power that we directed to manufacturing facilities. And with that came the need for more capital, and with that came the need for more predictability, because we didn't like to lose money. And so we've created an entire ideology around predictability. We want to control nature, we want to control the factors of production, we want to control human beings, and we want to control where our money goes. And the grand priests of predictability are, the business schools, Harvard Business Schools, the management consultants like McKinsey, the shareholder value ideology that is conveyed by investment banker. All these are the grand priests of predictability and a deterministic world. And we love our budgets, and we love our forecasts, and we love our KPIs, right? So that is essentially the world as we would like it to be. We would like to know that when I invest $10 million in a new production chain, it is going to deliver the results that I wanted to deliver. And by and large, we have succeeded, except when we don't succeed, right? But for the most part, our leadership ideology, our management ideology has succeeded very well. And the complicated world, by and large, has delivered on its promises. Our entire body of knowledge, of experience, of best practices, and of expertise has allowed us to produce, marvelous technologies, surgery, airplanes, buildings, etc. And by and large, we live in a world that is much more predictable than it used to be. So I'm not saying let's stop making budgets, let's stop trying to predict the future, but let's recognize the limitations of this approach, because it works in a lot of situations, and in some other situations it doesn't work because we are facing complex phenomena.
Well,
So,
Fabrice,
go ahead.
over the last 2 days, I was leading the Customer Experience Council, where we talked about the future trends of the world in customer, consumer, client behavior. And now we are in this world of AI and machine learning, which actually is making the complex world even more complex. And when we were talking with the CX leaders, they said that one of the significant indicators, significant customer experience trend for the future is the human touch. So although we're surrounded by AI and machine learning, and it will be even more in the coming years with all digitization that we are going through, but the human touch is actually very related to what you explain about the complexity, because the complexity includes the human touch, the human behavior. The complicated world, it's more like input, output, and there is always a solution as long as you apply the right processes and technologies. Do I interpret it right?
Absolutely, absolutely, Demet. So I think you're making a very good point, right? To operate in the complicated world, we need to have a problem-solving mindset. We look at something and we say, okay, I don't understand this. Let's problem solve. Let's create models. Let's get data. And if I can't really succeed in modeling it, then let's get more data, right? And that's essentially what happens every day in the corporate world, right? We problem solve. That's what we used to do, in my days at McKinsey. We were problem solvers. We look at something and we get data and we predict what's going to happen. So that problem-solving mindset is perfectly suited to the complicated world. Now, you mentioned the human touch, Demet, and as soon as we start dealing with human beings, it's a little bit like raising a child. We start, if only human beings behaved like molecules, right? Then we could create models. But unfortunately, it's not the case. And so, whereas if I, for example, have a production line and I need to cut costs by 10%, I could problem solve and look at changing my suppliers, increase the efficiency of the process, maybe find cheaper sources of energy, reduce waste, etc. And so I would be doing my problem solving. But when you look at a human system and you see, for example, I want to change the culture in my company. Well, good luck with that if you're trying to put equations on that and predictability on that, or I want to make my sales force more productive. I'm going to change the incentive system. Well, the graveyards are full of people who have changed their incentive systems and didn't really live to tell the tale because, they ended up with a huge mess on their hands. And no amount of expertise is going to really help you with that. Let me give you a simple example. You change your incentive system or you change your employee benefits thinking that it's going to help you to cut 5% of your personal cost, and you end up with a massive strike that costs you $500 million, right? So non-linearity, divergence, a small variation in input, I remove, the restaurant benefit, and I end up with a strike that cost me 3 months of production. So that's the nature of the complex world in which, and usually that's what involves, it's when we involve human beings, we tend to deal with a complex world.
I
Of course,
understand.
today we live in a very complex situation, right? Because we have so many drivers of uncertainty, and most of which are linked to human behaviors, right? So we have a healthcare uncertainty. So we don't know much about the virus. We don't know even whether a vaccine will be viable and when the vaccine would be produced in sufficient quantities to allow air travel to resume, for example. But the problem-solving approach, which was, oh, there's a virus, so we need to stop the virus from transmitting. So let's go everybody in lockdown. Well, genius idea. And I'm not saying that, I would have had a better idea, but that created a massive economic depression. And how deep is the depression? How long is the recession going to be? Nobody knows. That creates, in turn, a massive amount of social uncertainty with unemployment and social unrest, etc. And that will create political uncertainty, starting with the election in a small country called the United States in a few days, where no matter what the polls are saying, we don't know what the outcome of the election will be. So you can see how, because of all these human factors, we're facing really several layers of complexity, and no amount of problem solving is going to help us with that.
I see.
Does that make
I would,
sense?
it does make a lot of sense. I would like to remind the audience that you can pose questions or you can even tell your opinions by typing in the left bottom of your screen, and I will pose them at the right moment to Fabrice. Please continue, Fabrice. Thank you.
Okay, so in my view, there's no doubt, given all these sources of uncertainty, each of which is largely nonlinear and divergent, and not possible to create proper models, and we don't really have experience dealing with these situations, and no amount of expertise really is helping us with that. Otherwise, we wouldn't see governments, many of which are composed of, or at least some of which are composed of competent people, struggling, turning 180 degrees with their social distancing policies, and essentially completely at a loss because the problem-solving mindset is just not helpful. So we are facing a huge amount of complexity, and the traditional mindset is not helping us. I see that also in the corporate world with my clients. I think the response to the initial response to COVID and to the lockdowns and the stopping of air travel, etc. I think by and large, managers reacted in a fairly competent way. You know, they protected the revenue that they could. They reduced expenses. They protected the health and welfare of their employees. So we've seen a fairly competent response initially. But what I see now is a lot of leadership team essentially recalculating their budget every 2 weeks and sort of, you know, caught a little bit in a Groundhog Day, because they you know, no amount of forecast is going to tell you what your revenue is going to be for 2021. It's not a matter of how many hours you're going to spend on your budget. It's not a matter of getting more data. It's not a matter of bringing the experts. You can read, you know, the Goldman Sachs forecast, or you can read the Wall Street Journal. It is not going to help you with your 2021 budget, right? Chances are you're going to get it wrong, but you're not going to get it wrong 5%. You're likely to get it wrong 25%, 50%, because you have no clue what's going to happen next year. And that's the nature of complexity.
Okay, so we understand what complexity is, and we are facing effect. But is there a way to face it and to deal with it in a positive, in an effective way? Is there I'm sure there's not a formula, but what's the approach then to deal with this fact, which is actually impacting the whole world?
Actually, there's no formula, otherwise that would be problem solving. But yes, so there's a way to make sense of the world. And essentially in 4 steps, right? I would say number 1, you need to recognize complexity. Because if not every problem that you're facing is complex, a lot of problems that you're still facing today are complicated. So do not mistake complicatedness for complexity. Do not mistake complexity for complicatedness, because a wrong diagnostic will definitely lead to the wrong actions. If you diagnose a problem as complex, then you need to embrace it. Instead of rejecting it, or instead of saying, let's bring more experts, let's get more data, right? After that, you imagine possible futures, and finally you emphasize preparedness. So I'm going to walk you through these 4 steps, but that's essentially the approach.
This is like a mindfulness exercise, Fabrice.
Well, you know, when you get out of the certainty, the deterministic view of the world, right? You see, in a complicated world, or when you're facing a complicated phenomenon, you have sort of an ineluctable destiny to it, right? You know that if you know the initial state of the system and the inputs and how the system behaves, then you can predict how the system will look like in 5 minutes, in 5 months, in 5 years. An example is movement of the planets. I'm not saying that it is simple to predict the movement of the planets, but since Kepler, we know roughly what laws govern the movement of the planets, and we're able to predict, you know, what the sky will look like, and the tides and the phase of the moon 500 years in advance, right? So there's a sort of a destiny, you know, the inescapable destiny to the complicated world. When you're facing complexity, there's no more destiny, there's just emergence. So things emerge, they happen, right? It's not like nothing's happening, a lot is happening, but it's emerging by itself. And for that, I think you need really an ontological humility in front of that, and say, you know, I actually don't have the means to know what's happening, but I'm just, you know, in awe in front of what's happening, right? So that's really the change of mindset. So mathematical equations are not necessarily, I'm a mathematician, right, by training, but that's not going to help you, right? You need to introduce new dimensions, and particularly a certain spiritual dimension or philosophical dimension to this emergence.
Okay.
So step number 1, I think we've talked now enough about it. We need to recognize complexity. We don't like admitting that what's in front of us is complex. Why? Because, you know, we've been trained as managers to basically deal with problem solving, right? And we love deterministic thinking. As leaders, we are paid to know, right? Look, at the end of the day, if I go to my board of directors and I say, I don't know, that's not necessarily a career enhancing move if you do that too often. And they won't understand why they're paying you so much as a CEO, as a business unit leader, or as a competent professional, and you keep getting to them saying, I don't know, which is the truth when you're facing a complicated world. And by the way, our society has given rise to a lot of experts, and these experts are very loud. They never miss an opportunity to say what they think, even when they think what they think is completely wrong. So we see that with elections. Every major election, the experts get it wrong. But we saw that with the COVID crisis, where if you go back and trace the prediction of the experts, they came up with the V curve and the W curve and the J curve and the B curve and the K curve and what have you curve. And the reality is they have absolutely no clue. Right? So we don't like to recognize that we don't know, because a lot of us are paid to know. So that's why it is fundamentally difficult to recognize complexity, because we don't like it, and we don't like to admit that we don't know. The other reason is that we tend to be massively overconfident, and that's a human bias. It's been well documented. I think 93% of drivers in the US believe that they drive better than average, which is obviously statistically impossible. 90% of entrepreneurs are absolutely convinced that their business plan is going to work, and we know the success rate of startups. The one I like particularly is 84% of French males believe that they're better lovers than average. And again, it's statistically impossible.
Okay. Well, I would like to pause here. There are some comments from the audience. So somebody says that it's quite a phenomenological approach, and people agree with that. And I have a question. These are generic statements most of us already know. And do you have any concrete example of how a company has dealt with a VUCA or another model? The VUCA model.
So there's many companies that are applying the model that I'm describing today. The framework, by the way, that I'm describing has been in existence for at least 15 years and has started to be generalized among a number of companies, including, for example, where I live in Singapore. For at least a decade. So this approach to modeling the world is well documented, and I wouldn't say widely used, because for the most part, when I work with my clients, the concepts that I bring are still new to them, and I have a mix of private equity clients, Western multinationals, Asian conglomerates, and usually the framework is not used very widely, but it's been in use for a while. I'll give you a few examples later.
Okay, there's also a second part of the question. How do you get senior leaders to accept the need to understand complexity and embrace it? And from a leadership development perspective, how would you train the approach to ensure new leaders are able to embrace complexity and lead their people through complex situations and periods?
Yeah, so that's not an easy one, right? I think what I've observed is that in the work that I've been doing, particularly prompted by the pandemic and the need for leadership teams to come up with something else, with enough time to go through the concepts and the differentiation between complicated and complex, we usually manage to make some progress, and we take the different issues that we need to resolve, and we can organize them into the complicated issues for which we need expertise or data, etc., and the complex issues for which we need the approach that I'm describing here. What's tricky, particularly, so the theory behind this is not massively out of reach, even for moderately trained leadership teams. the real issue is how do you communicate that after that? Because it's not, one thing is to become enlightened, if you want, and to start waking up to the reality of the world in front of you. That's one thing. But how do you communicate that in a world where most of the people around you, in particular, your board of directors, for example, is not enlightened? And how, I had this concrete case a few days ago with the leadership team of a company that is owned by a private equity group, and the CEO and the leadership team said, we understand what you're telling us and your approach makes a lot of sense, but how do we communicate that to our private equity owners who are demanding, a very accurate budget for 2021? And herein lies the difficulty of the exchange. When someone believes that the world is complicated and somebody else has realized that the environment in which they're dealing is actually complex. Same with the staff, right? You're not going to go to your employees and say, guys, we really have no clue what's happening, right? So you need to modulate the message, because the staff will you don't want to raise the anxiety of the people who work for you. So you need to come up with not BS messages like we've seen a lot coming from some governments in the past 9 months, pretending to know. You have to acknowledge somewhat that you don't have all the answers, but this is what you're doing to gain more information. And as you will gain more information and you will develop a better understanding of what's going on, this is how you will come back to let them know what is happening and what you're doing, right? So there's a certain need to be humble, but authentic, and not trying to pretend that you know more than you actually do.
Okay, clear.
So, this overconfidence bias is actually what prevents us from really acknowledging that we deal with a complex world. And a silly example that I use with clients is the checkerboard on my illustration. I ask people, is A or B, which square is darker?
Shall we ask that to the audience now, Fabrice?
Yeah, go ahead. So A or B is darker.
So what do you think in this visual here? Is it A or is it B that is darker? Can you type in your answers? Okay, there's a lot of votes on A.
Yeah, there's a majority of A.
Yes, and there are some people who say that the letters have the same colors, but there's a big majority where people say that A is darker.
So look, if you're like me, you say A, right? And if you put a uniform gray stripe next to the checkerboard, you actually realize, as some of you have noticed, that actually A and B are the same color. So look, it's a silly optical illusion that illustrates that we all have cognitive biases, right? We perceive the world to be in a certain way when in fact the world is different. Okay, now what is particularly insidious about cognitive biases is that if I remove the stripe, now everybody knows that A and B are the same color. But still, this thing, personally, I've seen this, hundreds of times. This thing still screams at me that A is darker than B, right? And so even when I know that I have cognitive biases, I still fall victim to the cognitive biases. And that's what makes them really, really tricky, because as a leadership team, we may know that we have a tendency to be overconfident. We may know that, look, there hasn't been a single Olympic Games since 1960 that has been delivered on budget. Usually the average deviation is 180% over budget for Olympic Games. You would think that by now we know that we cannot deliver the Olympic Games on budget, and we still get it wrong every time, right? Massive projects always go over budget. I mean, I've rarely seen a project that goes under budget. So mergers and acquisitions, we always tend to overestimate the value creation, etc., etc., etc. Right? We have these cognitive biases, and even when we know that we have them, it's very difficult to catch, which is why we tend to under-recognize complexity and take the world for complicated.
Yeah, the audience says that actually you need to have very diverse teams also to embrace the complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll come back to that. The more you introduce diverse voices to your leadership team, and I'm not saying necessarily make them a permanent member of the exco, but the more voices you invite and you consult, even the most marginalized voices that you never want to listen to normally, the more you gain perspective of what's happening in the world. And I'll give you a few examples. But for a second, let's assume that in the interest of time, that you've admitted that the world is complex. Now what, right? And the second step is simply to embrace it and to embrace the fact that you don't know. And not only you don't know, but you cannot know. And instead of feeling in fear and insecurities at that, I draw a lot from Eastern spiritual traditions, and particularly Zen and the beginner's mindset. If you approach the world like a child, it's actually okay not to know. And not knowing doesn't mean that you do nothing, right? You don't throw your hands up in the air and say, I give up, right? The world is complex. I'm going to go home, hide under my pillow, and call me in 1 year when it's all over. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying stop wasting so much time pretending that you can predict what's going to happen in 2021. So if you must do a budget, and we all do a budget by all means, right? But don't get attached to your budget, for example, right? I'm going to show you a better way to think about what's going to happen in the future. And really, the better way is to start imagining, but with the imagination of a child, not the imagination of a middle-aged manager who relies on 25 years of experience, and I've seen it all, and my budget is this, and I'm going to do an optimistic case at plus 5%, and I'm going to do a pessimistic case at minus 5%. And so, the future of the world will be somewhere between my optimistic case and my pessimistic case, because that doesn't work.
And let's also have a most probable scenario as well, the third one.
Most probable scenario is what you want your board to accept, etc. I mean, we've all played those games, right? It's just that they're not useful in the current circumstances. So you need to imagine possible futures. And by imagining possible futures, I mean really, really thinking wide and broadly out of the box. So there's 3 ways that I like to advise my clients to imagine what may happen tomorrow. Number 1 is in your teams. And in your teams, in particular, I invite everyone to really get voices that you don't normally listen to, right? So bring in your frontliners, bring in your customers. You lead the customer experience, Demet. I mean, you need to invite the voice of the customer or the distributors. You need to invite the voice of your suppliers. You need to invite voices of people who don't belong to your company or your ecosystem, but will bring a very different perspective. Invite an artist, invite a philosopher, invite military operatives, from the special forces. These guys are trained day in, day out to face situations that are by nature unpredictable. What can you learn from the Green Berets or the Special Forces or the Navy SEALs? If you can invite one person to attend one session of your exco, you're going to learn a lot, right? So that's what I call in teams. Alone, because I think that as a leader, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to your teams to spend time alone in silence, disconnected, with the phone on airplane mode, preferably in nature. I'm a big fan of retreats. Those who know me know that, I organize retreats and spend a lot of time in retreat, but that's when the noise clears and the clutter clears, and you start seeing things that you wouldn't see normally when you're, have to answer 250 emails a day and your phone is constantly going ding ding, right? So spending time alone to start making sense. And finally, reaching out to communities and, horizontal communities, leveraging big data, using predictive markets, using Google Trends and other ways, to industry communities to start seeing patterns. If something moves at one corner of the spider web, you want to be able to hear it, right? And normally there's so much noise and we're so set in our ways that we don't hear it. So that's one way. But really, there can be a process to do that, and it's to identify what are the 2 or 3 major critical uncertainties that you're facing in your business. And it will vary business by business, so there's no template. But say, for example, just to take a simple example, say that your revenue next year depends on number one, GDP growth in your market, and number two, the customers' willingness to get out of their homes and shop at your outlets. Okay, very simple example. Well, these are the 2 critical uncertainties, meaning you don't control them. They're extrinsic to your business. But if you do a 2 by 2 matrix and you put one uncertainty horizontally, one uncertainty vertically, and you don't try to make it too clever, too simple. You say high, low, economic growth next year, high, low, customer propensity to buy my products at my outlets, high, low. And that's going to give you 4 scenarios. If you use 3 critical uncertainties, that will give you 8 scenarios. That's a bit more time consuming, but that's still okay. But don't really make it too heavy. And don't do these scenarios to predict the future. You can't. Don't even try to put probabilities on these scenarios. We always have, this one is a 5% probability, this one is a 30% probability. Forget it. You have no clue. Admit that you have no clue. But look at each scenario for its own merits and ask yourself, if that scenario happened, what opportunities would that create? What threats would that create? How would I need to adapt my business system to survive? What capabilities would I need to build to maximize my opportunities? And finally, what small safe to fail experiments could I create now so that if that scenario really happens, I'm better prepared and I'm one step ahead of my competitors, for example. So there's a lot that can be done from this scenario planning exercise. It's actually not scenario planning because you don't plan anything. It's a scenario exploration. Right?
You explore the possibilities, the scenarios.
Absolutely.
It's
You
more of an
imagine the
exploration.
future. And you just use that. And that's where you may invite, voices that you don't normally listen to help you with that approach. And you just will get a much deeper, much richer conversation than you would normally have if you're trying to force yourself to do a traditional budget for 2021 with a plus 5%, minus 5%, or maybe in these circumstances, plus 10 and minus 10. But that still doesn't do it, right?
Okay. Again, we have only 15 minutes left. If you have any questions, please type them in as we continue.
Okay, so we're reaching really the end of our recognizing complexity, embracing complexity, imagining possible futures. And the last stage is, well, now that I've imagined a few potential futures and I've explored them richly, I need to get prepared. I need to get prepared for what? Well, I don't know. I cannot know. But I have a few template futures in my head and I can design my small scale experiments and I'm going to try to be prepared for whatever emerges from the world, for whatever unfolds in front of us, right? And that's really the point of the last step of the approach, for which you can learn a lot. I was mentioning special forces earlier. I have learned a lot, guys, because when you jump behind enemy lines to retrieve a hostage or to take out a high value target, etc. You can have all the plans you want, but essentially from the moment you jump out of the plane, anything can happen, right? And that is the purpose of being prepared. Uh, it's to be able to react to whatever circumstances will be in front of you. And that's exactly the position we're in today as leaders. We need to be prepared. We cannot know the future, but the least we can do is to be prepared. And so several ways that you can engage your teams in being better prepared. I talked about designing safe to fail experiments, right? If you have $20,000 to spend, and assuming that's not going to bankrupt your company, where would you invest $20,000 to explore one of the scenarios that you have imagined so that you are a little bit better prepared if that scenario happens, right? One technique that I really like, it's so simple that it's almost embarrassing to describe it, but it's the red team, blue team, right? When you have polarization in your team, and some people want to do A and some people want to do B. Well, organize them in two teams and get the debate, right? Half of your team will defend A, half of the team will defend B, and that will allow you, instead of having everyone talking at the same time, as we normally witness leadership teams doing around the table, will allow you to have a much deeper discussion around both A and B. And if you have time, then you switch them, and the people who were defending A, you ask them to defend B, and they will need to think about all the arguments in favor of B. So that is a very rich way. Again, we cannot predict the future, but we can be prepared, and we can at least have given sufficient time to explore what might happen.
Okay.
A third technique, there's many more techniques, but the third one that I would mention here is the pre-mortem. So say that you've eventually decided to do A, whatever that is. Well, imagine 1 year from now, and it's been a complete flop. What could have happened? So you reverse engineer A, knowing that it's been a complete flop. What could have happened? And surely that approach will lead you to discover things that you may not have thought about before. So very simple techniques to engage your leadership teams around imagining the futures and getting better prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fabrice, the way you talk about the techniques and the approaches is quite simple and practical. But when you work with the CEOs, with the senior leaders, what do you see them most struggling with when it comes to practically applying these techniques? What do they struggle with the most?
The first struggle is really to recognize complexity, because we have been almost hardwired into thinking in terms of problem solving, and there's this myth of the leader as the hero, right? So we're here to slay the dragon as a leader, and we cannot fail, and we must have an answer to everything. And the approach, which consists of taking the beginner's mind and admitting that there's critical uncertainties that we know absolutely nothing about, and creating these scenarios is a little bit difficult for leaders to embrace at first. Many of them get there, of course. I would say that the more you rely on your experience and your pattern recognition, the least it helps you in these circumstances, because you think you've seen it all, and the reality is you have not. And so there's a shift that needs to happen. When I do that either with leadership teams or one-on-one with leaders, when they realize that not only they don't know, but they cannot know, and they cannot be expected to know, usually there's a release that happens, like a sort of like, like, okay, you mean I'm not supposed to be able to know that? I say, no, you cannot know, right? And then suddenly, there's a relaxation that happens, and now we can start working, right? So that's usually the most difficult step.
At the end of the day, we are all human beings. We have feelings, we have emotions, and there are patterns, there are trends that you can predict the future, but the future is actually very unexpected, expectable, right? Is that a right word? It's not expectable that easily. So embracing it and knowing that you cannot know everything, I think is a good starting point.
Yeah.
Are there, sorry, go ahead, please.
I was just going to interject. You say we're all human beings. I think we tend to forget that a little bit, and we almost behave like we don't have emotions.
Robots.
In the corporate world, when we describe someone as emotional, it's rarely a compliment.
Yeah.
But
Well,
you're
sometimes it's viewed as a weakness, right? Oh God, he's so emotional. She's so emotional.
exactly right. It's not a compliment, right? And so, but we are human. We are emotional, and sometimes we should trust our emotions, right? Because intuitively we know when we're facing complexity. I mean, we've been facing complexity for 7 million years, right? Since we became like the first breeds of early humans, right? So this has been with us. The predictive world, the predictable world has only been with us for 250 years, right? We have 7 million years before that when we had absolutely no clue what would happen tomorrow, right? We kind of trusted the sun to rise in the east and to set in the west, but that's about it, right? And we lived with that for millions and millions of years. But now, in the last 250 years, we behave as if we knew everything. And
Yeah,
I think we're seeing more and more that we don't know everything.
exactly. Well, somebody from the audience, they say that these are often considered as soft stuff, like to be emotional, that do not belong in the organization. And now authenticity needs to go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very true. This is very true. So, what to do with all that. What I'm introducing here is not that difficult to put in practice with your leadership teams, right? Start asking the questions that you don't normally ask, right? Ask yourself, when I look at the data, what am I expecting to see? What am I not expecting to see? What is my confirmation bias? I expect to see something, therefore I see it, right? We fall prey to that one too very often. Take multiple perspectives, invite, how would my competitor see the world? How would my customers see the world? How would the most marginalized workers in my company, how do they see the world? You might learn something from that and really learn to see the system as a whole, right? And again, I don't want to reinvent what has been done in response to the virus, right? I think mostly governments did the best they could. But thinking that you're going to ask people to stay at home for 3 months and not plunge the world in the deepest recession that it's ever seen, maybe that was the best thing to do. But it was a bit naive to seem surprised that we're now going into a recession, right? And so if you're trying to break down the system in independent parts, you're going to fail because when it's complex, the system behaves as a whole. And just like you cannot decompose a human being and say, oh, Fabrice is made of hair and muscles and blood, etc. And if I take it apart and then put it together again and I have Fabrice again, no. You can do that with a photocopy machine, but you cannot do that with a human being, and you cannot do that with a complex system. The
Okay.
complex system needs to be seen as a whole.
Okay. Well, the same person again from the audience is asking for a concrete example, any real example case where and when you have used it, this approach. Maybe
Uh,
without naming the client, you can just talk about a concrete case.
Yes, well, look, I'm working. I've advised an international insurance company very recently, right? And we did exactly this, right? To look at what are the. I mean, we spent time first of all to recognize and accept the complexity of the situation. They have a rather multi-channel distribution system with online brokers and individual agents. But we spend time to see, okay, what are the critical uncertainties that we're facing? And from there, we did a very simple 2 by 2. We break out the leadership team. There's 12, 13 people in the leadership team, and you know we assemble breakout groups, and 2, 3 people take one scenario, and you know spend an hour fleshing out that scenario, putting it a name and opportunities, threats, etc. And then you bring back that together, and that is a very, very rich decision that leads to not saying we know what's going to happen, because again, we can't, but what can we do to be better prepared for whatever will happen. So I've recently done that, a similar exercise with 2 insurance companies. We've discussed that with a travel company. It's you know extremely powerful. There's no rocket science behind, and by the way, rocket science is complicated. It's not complex, but it's extremely powerful to foster the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Fabrice. Um,
Hang on, just wanted
sorry.
to conclude on a message of it. Let me control the slide. Here we go. So, you know, numbers, you know, grand visions of market share, of EBITDA, etc., are not extremely useful given the wide range of uncertainty. But I would say if you stay true to your purpose, that should serve as a guiding light on what to do in navigating this situation. So saying that you want to achieve 25% market share is quite meaningless in the world of large turbulence like this, but saying that you want to be the best at distributing your product to the customers, or whatever your vision or your purpose is, should be your guiding light. So I'll finish here, Demet.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fabrice, for your thoughts. I love the way you explain these things as simple and practical, but I think it depends a lot on the approach of the leader and also the facilitator, the moderator, who makes these different perspectives come into place and take decisions out of that. So in a real world, although you say it's simple, I do not see it that simple to embracing complexity. But I do believe a lot that there are patterns and there's a way to embrace it. And we always need to keep the human perspective in place. And I think everybody now feels it and embrace it more than ever, that we're all human beings, although we may have different titles and we may have come from different cultures. I think the world is now all sitting at home and trying to deliver a purpose, which I think the main purpose is to be healthy tomorrow and to be successful. So thank you very much for sharing your insights, Fabrice. I would like the audience to spend less than a minute just to fill in the evaluation form. We have a couple of questions, and if you could give us your feedback, it will help us to improve ourselves for the future webcasts. I also want to announce that this is a leadership series. Last week we talked about how the brains work and what needs to be done to get the most out of all the brains in the business. Today we're talking about complexity leadership. Next week, my speaker Nina Glass will talk about sustainability leadership, which is going to be followed by coming webcasts on collaborative leadership, compassionate leadership, and there's one webcast where we're going to talk about the noble purpose. So if you're interested in these type of conversations, please log on to the conference board website and register to watch it live or at a time when it is convenient for you. Thank you so much again, Fabrice, and I wish you all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you.